Welcome to Rally the Cause, a podcast where we learn from top leaders and marketing experts in the nonprofit world. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, everyone. It's Jeff Rum. I'm the host of the Rally the Cause podcast, where I talk to top leaders and experts in the marketing world, in the nonprofit space. This episode is brought to you by Ignite. Ignite is a full-service agency. We focus on branding, campaigns, and digital marketing for nonprofits and purpose-driven organizations. At Ignite, we're both strategists and storytellers. We partner with nonprofits that have big ideas and bold visions for the future. Ultimately, we help them raise money and mobilize their audience. If you think we can help your organization, go to igniteaction.co or email jeff@igniteaction.co to get in touch with us to see how we can help. Today, I'm here with Nate Andorsky. He is the founder and CEO of Creative Science. They use behavioral science to build digital strategies and technologies for today's most innovative companies. Nate blends behavioral economics, design, and technology to help social innovators move people to action. As a co-founder of Creative Science, his team empowers social innovators to dream bigger by creating digital experiences, which at their core are human experiences. Nate has been featured in Forbes, Huffington Post, Inc. magazine, and others. And finally, Nate recently authored a book, Decoding the Why, a story-driven exploration on how companies can build, scale, and optimize new products and revenue streams leveraging behavioral science. And I noticed that there are over 30 five-star reviews on Amazon. So congratulations, Nate. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Very excited to be here, Jeff.
Great to have you. So tell me, for those who aren't familiar with it, what exactly is behavioral economics and why should nonprofit organizations care about this?
So you'll probably hear me talk about behavioral economics and behavioral science today interchangeably. So if I switch between the two terms, no, they're, for purposes of today's talk, more or less the same thing. But what's interesting about behavioral science is it seeks to understand how we make decisions. And what's interesting is that much of our decision-making happens outside of our conscious awareness. So behavioral science begins to lift up what are the factors in our environment that impact the way that we make decisions and help us understand those. And why this is so important for nonprofits is a lot of the work that you do as a nonprofit, whether you're in the advocacy space or the fundraising space or both, is you're trying to get somebody to take action. And oftentimes giving people rational reasons to do things isn't the whole entire picture. So behavioral science gives us a lens into what are the types of things that are going to increase the likelihood that a donor is going to give or a supporter is going to support that they're not going to be able to tell you yourself. So creates a whole new framework and a whole new foundation to think about fundraising and campaign strategies, the types of things that you're not going to be able to get from going to your donors and asking them.
Great. So if we started with fundraising as an example, many of the organizations we work with, their primary goal is to raise more money to make sure that they are financially viable for the work that they do. So can you give an example of like how an organization could use this framework or this model that you talk about to get donors to give more or to acquire new donors, things like that?
Definitely. I think the most prominent concept specifically as it relates to the nonprofit space is this idea of the identifiable victim or identifiable beneficiary effect. And this highlights the way that we make decisions as it relates to giving. And what's interesting about this is that if you took almost like a rational approach to asking somebody to give money, is tell them how big the problem is. And theoretically, the larger the problem, the more money they're going to give, right? But the way that we process information as it relates to giving is almost counterintuitive to this. So basically what the identifiable beneficiary / identifiable victim effect talks about is this idea that we have a tendency to offer greater aid for an individual person rather than a group of people, right? That whole sort of saying that says the death of a person is a tragedy, the death of 30,000 people is a statistic. And we often see that a lot of nonprofits, specifically in their outreach campaigns, will put stats in there. We're going to help 10 million people. We're going to help 90% XYZ. And the challenge with numbers and stats is we have a hard time conceptualizing. And one of the biggest recommendations that I tell nonprofits when we work with them, specifically through advocacy and fundraising, is the power of storytelling, but the power of storytelling through an individual. And there's a lot of behavioral science into why the identifiable beneficiary effect works so well. But oftentimes this is something that's overlooked, where nonprofits will go out and tell somebody about stats and numbers. And while stats and numbers help inform, what we have seen is it doesn't really tap into our emotional side. And in order to drive somebody to action, you need to be able to tap into their emotional side.
Got it. So it reminds me of that commercial with the Sarah McLachlan song. I forget the organization.
It's like in the arms of the angel.
The angel.
Yeah, and that was one of the first organizations that sort of pioneered this. But what's interesting about the identifiable victim effect is part of the concept is that when we see an individual person under hardship, we have the ability or feel the ability to sort of solve the entire of that specific problem, right? Well, when it's a group of people, you give money or support, you're solving part of the problem. And we have a tendency to want completion, right? So that's one of the reasons it connects so deeply. But the other thing too is that, and what's interesting about this too, is there was a study from the Science of Giving, is that we see this effect diminish not only when you move from one person to 30 or 40 people, but even when you move from one person to 2 to 3 to 4. And part of the reason is that as soon as you present somebody with a group of people, you have to start categorizing. You have to make generalizations about that group of people, and it's no longer as concrete. And if it's not as concrete, it's less. You can't connect as much to it, and because of that, it's less emotional.
Yeah, it's the ASPCA. That's the organization.
Okay,
and I just remember that, like when you watch that commercial, there's that you just look into that child's eyes or the dog that's on the screen, and you feel like, okay, I'm connecting to someone or something. So
exactly.
So when it comes to advocacy, organizations, obviously many are raising money, but some are also trying to get people to take action or do something so that they can make a change. Is it the same? Do you see it like kind of the same dynamic happening with that?
I think it's similar. And it's also, what's interesting about advocacy too, is if you look into and dig into the behaviors that drive somebody to advocate on behalf of an organization, you see a lot around this idea of social norm theory, of doing what other people are doing. There's also part of that too, is this connection with almost like a higher calling, right? So this idea that I want to be working towards something that's beyond me and myself, but I want to be working towards that with other people. And I think that's a lot of where you see the power of events, right? So not from a fundraising financial standpoint, but part of the power is to be surrounded by like-minded people in that respect, in that regard. But I think one of the things that we see specifically with advocacy is the feeling, and giving the feeling of people that they are part of a group of individuals that are all moving towards the same common goal.
Yeah. And you were telling me about earlier, before we were recording, about Autism Speaks as a client that you worked with and what you were able to do. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what the results were.
Yes. So we just actually launched, I think it goes live today or tomorrow, a community portal for Autism Speaks. So it's a place where various members that are associated with Autism Speaks and the community can go to get access to resources, connect with providers, etc. But one of the interesting things that we did about this portal is we actually integrated machine learning and AI into it. So instead of everybody being served the same content, we use Google Translate to index all the content. And then what begins to happen is, as a user on the platform, as you start to interact with various types of content, very similar to the way that Amazon works, the algorithm and the machine learning models become smarter and smarter and smarter, and it starts to serve up content that's relevant to your specific use case. So this was the first time that we've built many of these portals before. We actually built one similar for Global Genes, which is based out of California. But this was the first time that we were able to leverage this technology to really drive personalization within these portals.
So if it's not a portal, let's say a nonprofit is looking at their website, they know they have a lot of content on there. It's a mess. It's just been kind of piled on year after year. but they recognize that like we're in a new world now, and they want to redesign it. They want to make it more user friendly. They want their donors to feel inspired and engaged when they get there. Like, I know it's a process to go through a redesign, but like, what are the questions they should ask? Like, in your mind, based on the way that you all think, like, what are those initial questions that like an organization should be asking before they dive into a full like website redesign or development project?
Yeah, so I think there's three key pillars here. The first one is the website is a means to help drive the organization towards its larger goals. So really understanding where that fits in. Is it to help us get advocates? Is it to help us fundraise? Is it just so people know that we exist? And that's a really key point. The second thing, and this is an issue we run into sometimes when we're working with nonprofits, is like, do you really have clarity around your mission, vision, who your supporters and donors are? Because if that piece is not clear, all of that then trickles down to not being able to build a website. Because if there's no focus, you don't really know who you're building the site for. And when you come out of the gate and you start designing and it looks really nice and pretty, that's great, but it won't have any focus. So that's the big key piece. Really having clarity around who your donors are. And I'm not talking about if you're in the climate space, if you're just going to say, well, it's all climate supporters. Well, that's not true, right? You need to have real clarity on who those personas are, right? And the place within the journey that website facilitates. The second thing is, and you'll see this trend across the digital space, but specifically with nonprofits, is specifically on the homepage, the use of like high fidelity imagery, the use of storytelling, limited copy, right? Creating a really strong narrative. And then also when you're talking about stats and numbers, if you do put that information, you need to frame it in a way that people can conceptualize. So a perfect example of this is, instead of saying, we can help 90% of XYZ people, say we help or can help 9 out of 10 XYZ people. And the reason you want to do that is because we're able to picture 10 people in our head. 90%, even though statistically we know what it means, we can't conceptualize that. So making all of that content, what it is that you're talking about, really accessible. But the biggest thing I would say is the use of imagery and iconography to really evoke emotion through the site.
That's great. And when they go through that journey, so they get to the homepage, or someone has sent them a link to explore the site, obviously there's that, there comes a point in which the organization wants them to take an action, and whether that's making a donation or giving them their email address. What are could you give us like a couple of, I don't know, like tidbits, techniques, tips on like trying to get that conversion to happen?
Yeah. So on the donation side, again, and we've actually done a number of studies with this, and it's been really interesting. The storytelling piece too. You'll see a lot of times on the donation page, people put up stats and numbers, but we've tested storytelling versus stats and numbers, and storytelling, wins. We've also removed copy from the donation page, so it's no longer support the nonprofit. We've removed the nonprofit from that narrative, and that it's, for only, $10, for just $10, you can help change the life of a person, just like Nima, right? And we'll have that picture and that narrative on the donation page to prompt action. The other thing also, which is interesting, and we've seen a lot of research around this, is and this is almost 101. It's not even behavioral science, but like showing the potential impact. And you'd be surprised how many nonprofits completely miss that. Is like, make a donation, it goes into a black hole, and I have no idea what happens or what could happen. And then the last piece here is a lot of social norming, right? So we'll see on various websites and pages is giving people insight that other people are also doing this, because we take a lot of cues from what other people are doing. So whether it's a feed or a description of a recent donation, et cetera, but creating that sort of social norm that other people are doing this.
Yeah. It reminds me of I remember a Nielsen study that was done, it must have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, where they looked at all these folks going to nonprofit websites, and what people wanted to know is, number one, like, what do you do? Like, what does your organization actually do, and why do you exist? Which surprisingly, like, a lot of people would go to the website and not be able to answer that question. So it's like putting up front, like you said, in a story or using visuals, like, what is this organization about? And the second thing I remember was, where does the money go? Because a lot of, I've seen on like forms, for example, like some best practices, which includes like showing people where the dollars are going to go.
Right.
It's what people want to know. So
right.
I don't know if you have any experience with like monthly giving campaigns and why that is effective.
Yeah.
Is there science behind that? Could you share anything you know about that?
There's a couple of reasons. So first of all, and when I was writing my book, I interviewed, and there's a whole chapter actually on Charity Water in my book, but I was interviewing the chief product officer, and they had a 98% retention rate on monthly donors. And this is actually, it's a gold mine for monthly donors or for nonprofits. And one of the reasons is the retention rates are astronomical, right? Most donors, the retention rates, I think, around like 45 to 50%. So somebody comes year one, the chance of them coming back the next year is around 50%. Monthly donors, once they opt in, for the most part, like they don't cancel. The other thing is they give more over the course of a year. So on average, I think the donation over the course of the year, if you're a monthly donor, is about 20% higher. And this is for a number of reasons. The challenge is getting people to opt into the monthly donor program. And part of the reason this works is because of something known as hyperbolic discounting. We tend to discount money as it moves into the future, right? So the salience of spending $20 today psychologically is much harder than committing to spending $20 a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, right? It's a little bit easier for me to swallow $10 a month versus paying $100 today, even though over the course of a year, the $10 is actually more, it's $120, right? And that's part of the power of monthly giving programs. And if you think about it in the for-profit industry around like a SaaS model, right? Where you get somebody to sign up and it's recurring revenue. For nonprofits, this is a gold mine because then they have guaranteed incoming revenue that they're able to project programmatic services against, right? The challenge is, number one, getting people into the monthly donor program, but you would be surprised because of the way that purchasing and giving habits have changed. I don't want to say it's easier than you think, but the bar is not as high as you think it is. And there are some specific tactics and some studies that we've actually done of how you can convert either one-time donors into monthly donors or people who've never donated to before into a monthly giving program.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's like I guess it's like a Netflix subscription or gym membership. I mean, once you do it, it's hard to, you don't usually cancel.
Right. Exactly.
So it's fascinating. So who do you love to learn from? Like, obviously there are a lot of people who are doing the kind of in this space of behavioral economics. Who are like those that you look up to and admire in this world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of just behavioral science in general, there's the Center for Advanced Hindsight, which is down at Duke, and they actually have a function of their lab that focuses on giving. So that's a really interesting place to look. Dan Ariely, he's one of the big name behavioral scientists in the space. So he's definitely one. And then you have like Danny Kahneman and Cass Sunstein, for example, that are sort of at the forefront of a lot of this work. And it sort of spans. Some of these individuals are more academic focused. Some of them are on the applied side. So Dan's much more on the applied side, which I find fascinating because that's where the rubber meets the road. But those are a few of the folks.
That's cool. So you mentioned your book earlier, and I wanted to ask you, what was the premise behind writing it? What did you learn from it? What can nonprofits learn from this book?
Definitely. So the book is called Decoding the Why. It's how behavioral science is driving the next generation of product design. And the aha moment came when I realized that the way that we typically build marketing campaigns, the way that we build new products and features for products is we go out to our customers, our donors, or our users, and we say, what do you want? What do you like about this? What don't you like about this, et cetera? And the reality of it is we're not consciously aware of much of what drives our decision-making. So we're asking our donors, our supporters, our users, our customers to explain the rationale behind decisions that they don't really truly understand themselves. The stories they give us are a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole entire narrative. So I thought to myself, oh, that's really interesting. A lot of times when we build these campaigns, that's what we do. And I said, well, behavioral science helps us understand the types of things our customers can't tell us. I wonder if people are building technology, digital campaigns, et cetera, using behavioral science, because it seems like a big missing piece of the puzzle. Then I quickly realized that nobody really is. A lot of the research that comes out of academia stays in academia. And it's a personal passion and interest of mine. So I said, well, I would love to explore this further. And the opportunity came about to write a book and explore the intersection of behavioral science and product design. So that's where the book came out of. And it was, it's funny when you write a book, when you really write anything, it forces you to truly understand what it is that you're talking about. And that's really what it did. It gave me the opportunity to think through very complex concepts, but I had to talk about them in a way that somebody that doesn't have a deep background in behavioral science could understand. And that was one of the big benefits for me of just working through my own ideas and concepts.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, the book launched during the pandemic. That must have been.
Yes. So
that must have been an interesting book launch.
Yeah. It launched in May of last year. So it was a few months into the pandemic. Because prior to that, I had going to go like a book tour, all that kind of stuff, speaking talks. And then the pandemic hit. And I said, well, I'm just going to launch it. And I can always try to get the talks back later. So
yeah, no, it's great. And people can find it on Amazon. Is that the best place to get the book?
Amazon. Yes, it is.
Great. What would a nonprofit what's a, one thing they would get out of reading your book? Like, how would they be thinking differently? Let's say it's a marketing director or someone who's thinking about changing the behavior of donors.
So there's two big things. The first thing is the book is premised on this whole concept of the say, do, why data. So a lot of what I talked about when you go out and you get interviews and focus groups, et cetera, that's what we refer to as say data, right? It's anything your donors are telling you. Then there's do data, that's analytics. So go on your website, Google Analytics, heat mapping, tracking, to anything that shows you what people are actually doing. And typically what happens is the say data doesn't match the do data, right? So people say one thing, they do another thing. And what the book fills in and what we do is the WHY, the why data, right? Explaining why you're seeing this go on your website or your product, et cetera. And it begins to help you understand why there are not correlations between the two. And it gives you a really good primer on what behavioral science is, the different theories and how they could be applied. And then specifically the last chapter is called Driven by Emotion. And it talks about Charity Water's monthly giving campaign, but it specifically digs into the science behind how they leverage storytelling to get people to opt into that campaign and the methodology and the framework used behind how they craft their stories. So it's a really powerful technique that can be used for a monthly giving campaign, but it's also something that could be used for just outreach in general. And it also gets a lot into how we view and process information as it relates to money, right? Donations and charity is all about money, right? And having a better line of sight into that can help inform the way that you make giving asks.
Yeah. I can't tell you how many times Charity Water comes up in my day-to-day conversations and on this podcast.
Right.
They are the gold standard, I think, of in the nonprofit world. Are there others that you've seen that are doing things well, other nonprofits besides Charity Water?
Yeah, there's Kiva.
Kiva, yeah.
They're like a micro lending platform. And they actually, I think they teamed up with some behavioral science consultancy to launch some studies. They're doing really good work. There is also, it starts with a W, the name's escaping me right now. I can't remember the name. But in terms of just campaigns in general, I mean, World Wildlife Fund, I mean, they have some pretty remarkable stuff that they put out. We used to work with an organization called Malaria No More was pretty phenomenal. And then some of the bigger organizations I know are doing a little bit of split testing and some of this behavioral science to attract donors and supporters. I know the Sierra Club actually is pretty sophisticated in the way that they deploy their methodology. So,
very cool. Great. Well, Nate, before we go, I want to ask one thing because you're a CEO running a company. I'm in the same boat. What are a few of your daily rituals that you find most important? Like, what do you do every day that kind of centers you? Or I imagine you have a lot going on. We're also still in a somewhat of a pandemic, and the world's a little nutty sometimes. Like, what any daily ritual?
Yeah, yelling at my staff makes me feel a lot better. I'm just kidding. No, I do try to work out in the morning. Whether it's swim or run or bike is really nice for me. It's interesting because as the CEO and the founder of a company, like you're obviously very passionate about what you do, but you have to intentionally keep distance between you and your work. You can't get too attached to it because it will just, your sort of emotional swings will just drag you back and forth through the mud with how the company goes. So, and I find, and I say that as long as I can make a decent income and work with really smart people on challenging problems on a day-to-day basis, that's a big win for me. So that's sort of my, I would say, focus and mantra with creative science.
I got to start swimming every morning if that's your thing, because I used to swim a lot and
really?
It's been a while.
Yeah, I try to, but now with COVID, you have to make an appointment at the YMCA and like all the slots, they're just always booked. So I used to swim like 2 or 3 times a week, and now I get there maybe once a week if I'm lucky. So,
well, hopefully soon things will get better and you can start swimming again.
Yeah, right.
Nate, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for being part of the show. And if anyone wants to reach out to you or Creative Science, where should they go?
Creativescience.co is a website. It's not .com, it's a .co. And then you can drop me an email, nate@creativescience.co, or LinkedIn. Feel free to friend me. I guess it's still called friend on LinkedIn. I don't know. Connect with me or shoot me an email.
Awesome. Nate, thank you. And
thank you, Jeff.
We'll hopefully talk again soon.
Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks for listening to Rally the Cause podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.